Hello. Hello. Good afternoon, everyone. We are starting the afternoon session of the conference. I hope you had a good lunch break and are now ready for the last formal session of this platform meeting. So in the past day and a half, we have heard exchanges about the opportunities and the challenges of the green transition in Europe. We engaged in discussions on the implementation of the Just Transition Fund, of the different governance models employed by the European regions on just transition, on how to engage the industry as well as workers' union in this transition. In this session now, we will turn our focus away from the EU to other countries in the world that are equally engaged in the process of transition. We will hear experiences of the countries located outside of the EU, with regard to the governance model on transition and how they embrace the green transition. After a keynote speech by Commissioner for Energy, Simson, we will hear a scene-setting presentation by the OECD on their new initiative called EFFECT, and then turn to our panelists that are with us here online today. The panelists are from South Africa, Indonesia, Colombia, and the US. To learn more from them about the processes and the challenges they are facing in engaging on the transition to climate neutrality. So it is for my honor to give the floor to Commissioner for Energy, Ms. Simson. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. It is an honor to be together with you this afternoon, and I can confirm that this is a very important event today. We will open, as I understand, the last session of the 7th Just Transition Platform Conference on the international dimension of just transition, and I'm delighted to see so many different stakeholders in the room and also online. Not only from EU, but also from other regions globally. When we first announced the European Green Deal over 3 years ago, we made one thing very clear. Europe's transition to a sustainable climate neutral economy could either be just and work for all, or would not work at all. And this is not an easy thing to do. The race towards clean energy and climate neutrality is on, but even within the EU, different member states and regions had different starting positions. And the same goes for our neighbors and international partners. Many of them are already on the front line of multiple crises, so ensuring a successful energy transition delivered for all fairly and justly is all the more critical in this international context. Today's session on the international dimension of the Just Transition Platform will be a valuable exchange between European and international stakeholders impacted by the energy transition. I'll kick off by outlining the EU's firm commitment to a just transition in a new energy reality and how we are building on our own experience to collaborate with our neighborhood and beyond. I must admit that last year was difficult. It was not only difficult here in Europe, but also globally. Extreme weather events continue to impact lives and livelihoods around the world. And just as we were coming out of the COVID crisis, Russia's invasion of Ukraine and also its manipulation of energy resources put energy systems under strain. So soaring energy prices drove up inflation and the cost of living, and consumers were the first to suffer. However, the European Union reacted quickly and decisively to cushion the worst of the crisis, and despite the challenges, no EU member state with a coal phase-out date has backtracked on their long-term commitment. You remember that in 2021, the coal consumption in EU was significantly down. And despite the fact that 2022, there was slight increase, overall carbon emissions dropped in EU as only region globally by 2.5%. And just like many regions within the EU, international partners are also ramping up efforts to phase out coal and other fossil fuels in line with national contributions under the Paris Agreement. Dear friends, the energy crisis has made the energy transition even more important and urgent. But we have a duty to deliver this accelerated transition fairly and justly, leaving no one, no region behind. And last year saw a strong focus on support to the just transition on coal and carbon-intensive regions. Member states drew up territorial just transition plans, which will enable them to qualify for support under the EU Just Transition Fund. And these plans outline the pathway to coal phase out and phase down until 2030, and the actions taken to lessen the socio-economic impacts of the transition. The EU initiative for coal regions in transition has also been providing valuable support for carbon-intensive regions for a number of years. However, to achieve our ambitious climate goals and drive forward a just transition in line with Sustainable Development Goal 7 of the United Nations, international collaboration is critical, and therefore the EU is building on its work and experience on the just transition with a neighborhood and international partners. We are pursuing several different avenues. First, under the initiative for coal regions in transition in the Western Balkans and Ukraine, we are very closely engaging with our neighborhood and doing so already since 2019. Our goal is to help Western Balkans and Ukraine plan their phase out of domestic coal while ensuring a just transition and security of supply. And there's been high interest and ambition, even in Ukraine, where the energy landscape has drastically changed. I'm glad to see many follow-up partnerships and projects emerging between coal regions in the EU and Western Balkans and Ukraine. And one recent milestone was the Berlin Summit last November, where the Declaration on Energy Security and Green Transition in the Western Balkans was successfully adopted. Second, we are developing a global platform for coal regions, together with our member state Germany, to share our experience and support others in their just transition. Building and expanding on our experience here in Europe, this global platform will cover 8 countries outside the European Union. Its main aim is peer-to-peer exchanges to share knowledge and policies and approaches for a just transition in regions affected by coal phase-out. In the next panel discussion, you'll hear from representatives from 3 of these countries involved in this platform. Third, the EU also supports the Just Transition Energy Partnership concept initiated by G7 members. The focus here is on partner countries with significant coal resources dependency. The first Just Transition Energy Partnership was launched with South Africa already in 2021 at the margins of COP26. And their Just Energy Transition Investment Plan was subsequently endorsed at COP27. And last November and December, Just Transition Energy Partnerships were also signed with Indonesia and Vietnam. They aim to mobilize $20 billion and $15.5 billion respectively over a 3 to 5 year period to support just energy transition needs. Moreover, we work with our international partners to drive forward the decarbonization of our economies, to increase energy savings and efficiency and reduce the pressure on energy prices. In particular, our aim is boosting renewable energy resources and hydrogen as well as energy access, contributing to the United Nations Agenda 2030. And fourth, international cooperation with our key partners is, of course, important. And one example is our collaboration with the United States. Since the war in Ukraine began, the United States has been an important partner in helping us to diversify away from our dominant supplier. But we are also working with them on fostering a just and equitable energy transition. And this was on the agenda also couple of weeks ago when we had our last EU-US Energy Council. And our focus is especially on energy poverty, economic and workforce development assistance for communities in transition, and those experiencing environmental hazard exposure, and how we cooperate internationally on the just transition. So, dear participants, today's session is an opportunity to strengthen the community of practice on the just transition between stakeholders and around the world. Next, you'll heard from OECD, and then you'll get insights from our partners from the United States, South Africa, Indonesia, and Colombia. So please make the most of it, listen, share, and learn. And over the past year, the energy world has changed in ways we could never imagine when we first set up Just Transition platform. But our goal not only remains the same, the stakes are now even higher. So let's continue working together for an energy transition that is good for our planet, for our people, and for our future. And I wish you very fruitful discussions today. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Commissioner, for these inspiring words. And now I would like to introduce Ms. Lara Liberty on the stage. Ms. Liberty is the head of the Natural Resources for Development Department in the OECD. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the opportunity to address this forum today. I represent the OECD Development Center. I will tell you a few words about who we are, because we are part of the OECD, but we are also a bit different. The center was created upon the proposal of John Fitzgerald Kennedy 60 years ago as a place for countries at different income levels and development levels to work together on common development issues on equal footing, learning from one another, and building collaborative policy solutions to development challenges. So basically, what you're doing here between regions, I've been trying to reproduce this model at the international level. That's why the center has members from across Asia, Europe, Latin America, and Africa. And half of them are OECD and half are non-OECD countries. And you will hear from South Africa, Colombia, and Indonesia, who are all members also of the Development Center. I have a PowerPoint presentation. Yes. So why we are focusing on the just green transition at the Development Center, because this was identified as a key priority for development globally, but in particular for developing countries. And why it is important for developing countries? Because it can act as a game changer and provides the opportunity for a paradigm shift for achieving sustainable development objectives that reconciles human welfare with ecosystems, as we have heard also from the Commissioner. But to make this happen, we need to really get the transition right. And this means essentially ensuring that this transition is people-centered, providing solutions to already unmet basic needs in developing countries, improving social welfare, and creating new livelihood opportunities, while correcting historical inequalities and addressing climate, environmental, and social injustices. So this requires recognizing in the first instance that developing countries have contributed least to the causes of climate change and cumulative global greenhouse gas emissions, whilst being most affected and disproportionately affected by its physical impacts. Developing countries are also least equipped to manage the risks and seize the opportunities that arise from this transition. And for this reason, the contribution of each country needs to reflect the capacity, resources, and means to take action. Equally important, as the Commissioner recalled, is the need to account for differences between countries as they start from different points, and they have different needs and priorities, natural resource endowments and industrial bases and capacities. And this means that the transition will necessarily progress at a different pace and along different pathways based on national circumstances. So we have tried to address this difficult issue, the Development Center, working with developing countries, international organizations, industry, civil society, and academia to assist, in particular, fossil fuel developing producing countries and mineral-rich producing countries to chart realistic and equitable low-carbon transition pathways. This process, which we initiated back in 2018, led to the development of the Equitable Framework and Finance for Extractive-Based Countries in Transition, in short, EFFECT, which was facilitated by the European Commission and Nigeria, and launched at COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh. What is the value proposition of EFFECT? Its main purpose is to bridge the divide between the global north that is accelerating, as we have heard during the conference, is accelerating towards decarbonization and fast-track the replacement of fossil fuels with clean technology to build a clean, green, and zero emission future, while developing countries risk being left behind, despite their current negligible contributions to global cumulative emissions, the vast energy deficits that endanger lives and hinder economic development, and have trouble accessing finance to build new climate-resilient infrastructure. So our efforts has been really to understand where these countries are starting from, and in particular, the challenges they are facing. The reality is that they are still struggling to recover from COVID-19, and they're grappling with inflationary pressures, high interest rates, considerable debt burdens, and an increasingly constrained fiscal space, while also facing some of the worst impact of climate change. This means that the resources available to them to advance the just green transition are very limited. And meanwhile, millions of people still lack access to affordable clean energy. It's against this backdrop that we have also tried to understand the specificities of fossil fuel producers that, on top of these challenges, are also facing additional constraints since they are heavily exposed to fossil fuels as a source of export revenues, energy, and employment, with knock-on effects on infrastructure that is built around energy-intensive projects, such as petrochemicals, fertilizers, and cements. They are also highly exposed to the global decline, projected global decline in fossil fuel consumption, as fossil fuel exports can account for 60% of their revenue. And they could see a drop of 51% in fossil fuel revenues in a shift to a low-carbon world over the next 2 decades. At the same time, they are fast urbanizing, and they are, of course, under demographic pressure, which means that they need to meet an increased demand for energy, while their infrastructure networks and also distribution networks remain very poor. So, against these challenges, of course, this just transition, as you know, brings opportunities with cities, infrastructure, and industries that in many parts of the developing world are yet to be built. The just transition provides the opportunity to transition to more efficient clean technologies and modes of production. And in that respect, some regions are already performing very well. For instance, Latin America renewables already account for 33% of total energy supply in the region, compared to a 13% average globally. They can tap into the opportunity created by the shift towards cleaner technologies to develop their industries in a way that is climate compatible, participate in green regional and global value chains, and become green industrial hubs. They can also create more and better jobs, access new sources of finance, and build a new social contract that places social and environmental justice, sustainable development, and people's well-being at its core. Of course, the problem is how to do it concretely and how to manage trade-offs. So fossil fuel developing countries need, first of all, to manage the uncertain outlook for fossil fuels in a global decarbonized economy, and address the dilemma of pursuing economic growth while limiting greenhouse gas emissions and ensuring energy security and affordability. They also need to preserve macroeconomic and fiscal stability that is under stress while reducing reliance on fossil fuel revenues. They also need to preserve their competitiveness in order to find an export market for their resources. And in order to do so, the main recommendation that is contained in effect is that wherever fossil fuels are part of the energy mix, they should be produced in as clean way as possible, with the deployment of the best available technology for methane emissions reduction, zero routine flaring, CO2 abatement solutions along the value chain. However, both established and emerging producers investing in gas and more broadly fossil fuel projects, we need also to carefully assess the risk of stranded assets and consider that technological choices can have long-term consequences. And the opportunity cost of using fossil fuels should be weighed against also the benefits of alternative pathways based on the use of renewables. As you know, the Russian war of aggression against Ukraine has determined a reconfiguration of energy trade relationships, and this have created windows of opportunities for exporting countries to benefit from new export routes. But the important thing here is to realize that developing countries should not distract from the long-term trend towards declining fossil fuel demand and declining export revenues. And they should also consider the costs associated with the development of fossil fuel projects that normally take 30 to 40 years, and the time frame for benefiting from this short window of opportunity for their exports. In the second pillar of effect, we have tried to assist those countries in managing a sustainable phase down of fossil fuels and eventually a phase out through the delivery of just transition plans for affected communities, industries, workers, and poor households, including through the rollout of social protection schemes and active labor market policies. We have also addressed the challenge of limited fiscal resources available and the upfront costs that they need to face in order to navigate through this transition. And that's why the Pillar 2 outlines strategies to ensure that any fossil fuel infrastructure is transition ready, enabling the repurposing for low carbon reuse in order to avoid risks of high carbon lock-in and stranded assets, and also bridge used infrastructure gaps while limiting upfront capital costs. Pillar 3 is about what you discussed yesterday about adopting a systemic approach, an ecosystem approach, and how fossil fuel developing countries can seize the transformational opportunities associated with the low carbon transition by creating new revenue streams through green industrialization, valuing natural capital, and building low carbon value chains with more value added produced locally. It is crucial for developing countries to switch from the export-led growth models of raw materials to really the development of segments of the value chain where they can create, out of which they can create opportunities for employment and growth. In terms of financing the transition, this will require mobilizing vast financial resources from both public and private sectors. The IEA indeed estimates that these financial, the mobilization of capital basically would be around $1 trillion US annually, which is 7 times what it is today, just to give you the magnitude of the problem in order to put the world on track to meet net zero emissions by 2050. So this requires mobilizing public finance to catalyze greater public investment, including through risk mitigation instruments. But the reality is that public finance has a relatively poor track record in mobilizing private finance in emerging and developing countries. And capital flows are not flowing where they're most needed. So we've tried to look into alternative also options in order to, for these countries to generate new revenue streams, as I said before, and also to address misaligned incentives, like the reform of inefficient fossil fuel subsidies that are often regressive and not well targeted, and the progressive introduction of a carbon pricing in order to level the playing field between emissions intensive and greener technologies. As the Commissioner recalled, pursuing a just transition globally requires new forms of international cooperation. And that's why we believe that EFFECT can support the delivery of a new global deal for a just green transition by turning the common but differentiated responsibilities that different countries have into opportunities for win-win outcomes. This entails, for instance, using the shift towards decarbonization to support sustainable industrialization in developing countries, not only through renewable deployments, but also through local manufacturing and the creation of green industrial hubs. This can also include supporting developing countries to adapt to new stringent requirements for carbon-intensive products, including the carbon border adjustment mechanism, whose purpose is perfectly legitimate and understandable, but this kind of measure can have also impact on the competitiveness of exporting countries. And that's why international cooperation is essential to ensure that cross-border climate measures are coupled with finance, technology, and capacity transfer to build decarbonized competitive economies in developing countries. And also support is provided in order to support the gradual introduction of carbon pricing in a way that preserves the competitiveness of local industries and offset negative impacts on poorer citizens. This new model for international cooperation can also be based on new forms of partnership between importer and producer countries to ensure that the renewed concern about energy security do not lock developing countries into high carbon pathways with risks of stranded assets and high carbon lock-in. And in that respect, I think it's interesting to look at the World Bank's Imported Flare Gas Index, which basically tracks importer country exposure to flaring throughout the oil and gas value chain. And this could be a tool that could be used to develop new approaches to international cooperation in order for importer countries to support producing countries to reduce methane and CO2 emissions from oil and gas trading. How we intend to move forward after the launch of EFFECT? We intend to implement EFFECT to support delivery of a just green transition in fossil fuel and mineral-rich developing countries and also globally, more broadly. And the idea is to continue to act as an honest broker and bridge builder to host a platform on dialogue and peer learning on the just low carbon transition, precisely to address these difficult issues of the cross-border impacts of low carbon policies. Also supporting the development of just transition indicators in order to help those countries understand how they can progress towards the achievement of more sustainable outcomes through their efforts to achieve low carbon development, and experience sharing on the just energy transition partnerships to explore new models for international cooperation. We have also established a community of practice on gas to assist developing countries understand the risks and opportunities of using gas as a transition fuel. And we are also using EFFECT to support the development of low-carbon roadmaps in developing countries that have asked for our assistance. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Lara. Does anyone have any questions still for Lara, based on the presentation that she gave? There's a question.
Hello, my name is Magdalena Bartecka from Polish Green Network. Thank you for this presentation. I feel really inspired by what you presented, and for me, the most important thing in this process is to understand in Europe that the emissions that are in the global south, in the developing countries, are our emissions, that we exported those emissions, so it's our responsibility to find a solution that we could exchange knowledge, expertise, and support global south in their pathway to climate neutrality. And from my experience, especially working closely with Sri Lanka, there is so much of openness for the solution like this. And when you said about the leapfrog, it's exactly the case. because of the crisis of the energy supply and the blackouts that are happening every day in Sri Lanka, they are more open to implement solutions that in Europe we need to work on them for years to be implemented. So here is a good example where the things can be implemented faster. And especially with the tradition for example, for cooperatives. I'm giving again an example of Sri Lanka where the tradition of cooperativism is very, very long. And based on that, we can build energy communities there because many people are living off the grid already. So we can implement solutions that are based on of being off the grid, creating energy communities. So I am very happy that I've been on Just Transition platform, I think, many times. And I'm very happy that this time we have a session about this global responsibility and accelerating just transition beyond Europe. So thank you for that, and I keep my fingers crossed for the progress.
Thank you. Lara, you want to respond?
Thank you very much for your comments. And indeed, I think there is huge room also for peer learning, to foster peer learning between advanced economies and developing countries, because as you said, they're also set for themselves ambitious targets, and they're looking for practical, pragmatic solutions in order to accelerate this transition. They are very open and ready to pursue low-carbon development pathways. The issue is to find providing the necessary support in terms of technology, financial resources, institutional and capacity building. And I think the knowledge that is in this room and the wealth of experience that you are sharing would also greatly benefit developing countries, because they would already have the opportunity to learn lessons from you, and where possible, as you say, leapfrog to clean energy solutions. Thank you.
And this is actually the perfect transition to now inviting in our 4 panelists to join us in the discussions. We cannot, yeah, here they are. Welcome to all of you. So I will just introduce you. I will start with Mr. Rudi Dix. He's the head of the Project Management Office in the Private Office of the President of South Africa. Rudi is also responsible for implementing the Presidential Jobs Summit Framework Agreement and the Youth Employment Initiative. Then we also have here with us Mr. Dadan Kusdiana. He's the Director General for Renewable Energy of the Ministry of Energy and Mineral Resources in Indonesia. Thank you for joining us here today. Then we also have with us Mrs. Joana Castellanos. She's the team leader for the Just Energy Transition Roadmap at the Ministry of Mines and Energy in Colombia. And then lastly, here with us is Mrs. Kate Gordon. She's the senior advisor to the US Secretary of Energy, Jennifer Granholm, at the Department of Energy of the United States. Thank you so much for joining us here today. I will go straight into the questions for you. So that we can have this sharing of experiences and learning that were mentioned by Commissioner as well as by Lara. So Mr. Dix, South Africa really is the front runner in Africa when it comes to the just transition. As was already presented by Commissioner Simson, you were the first country to sign the Energy Transition Partnership in 2016 and have elaborated a significant investment plan for the just transition. Can you perhaps tell us a little bit more about the approach to just transition that you are taking in South Africa, and whether this has changed in the light of the current electricity supply crisis that South Africa is going through?
Thanks. So can you hear me clearly?
Yes, we can.
Before I continue? Okay, wonderful. So yes, of course, thanks so much. We've been able to, as you say, be a lead in the just energy transition. Sort of feedback. Sorry, I'm just trying to.
I think we are working on that. Maybe.
Is that okay?
Yeah, it seems better now.
Still feedback. Okay, let me continue. So I think that it's been quite an important journey that we've had. I mean, this all started when we announced quite an ambitious nationally determined contribution target. And we were one of the few countries that didn't set a specific target, but set a range, right? And I think that's been important, from a lower to a higher range, which is more ambitious. And I think that had stimulated quite a lot of interest from global north countries, and particularly developing countries, which resulted, of course, in the political declaration, as was said by the Commissioner earlier, that was announced on the sidelines of the COP26 in Glasgow. And that, of course, has been the partnership with the European Union, Germany, France, the USA, and, of course, the UK government. And it's been a phenomenal journey because on the one side, you kind of a bit worried about it being one of the first of its kind, and whether you're going down the right path. And if you're going down this path, there's no turning back. And of course, are we making the right decisions? And on the other hand, it is the right decision that we've made, and we think it's going to be important. So the colleague who had spoken earlier on had spoken about the importance of just transition in developing countries. But it's also not just about exporting the ideas. It's also, it's about the acknowledgement of the cost of transfer of carbon emissions, and the fact why we've entered into this kind of conversation with developed countries around, to be able to support their transition. So it's been quite an important journey as we have gone thus far. It's important that we framed it in a just energy context, and that's also quite critical, because the just component, given that we have quite a large carbon sector, 42% of our greenhouse gas emissions is produced by electricity. And if we are wanting to focus on a decarbonization effort, it would probably be best to start over there, but it has a significant risk factor, of course. 15 of our 18 coal power stations are coal power stations. Also, it's not, a situation if coal power stations with coal mines are spread across the entire country, it may just be easier to manage. The 15 of these 18 stations are all concentrated in one province of the country, and you will understand how coal has been mined and how power stations work, is that it's quite integrally linked to communities and to value chains and a whole set of supply developments that is there. So when you shut down or decarbonize a power station, it means the mine linked to that power station is closed. It means small businesses and communities that depend for work and income from that power station or from the mines are shut down. So it has an important devastating effect. And for us, the conversation of the just component of that is quite critical. And it's why we entered into this conversation with the international partner group. The second point I think I just wanted to make is that, of course, in the just energy transition, we had focused not only on the energy sector, we had focused on two other particular sectors as well. The second was the development of new energy vehicles. And this is quite important because automobile assembly and manufacturing, is quite a large export sector for us. Our largest trading partner is the European Union. And if the EU, of course, as you're discussing, introduces a carbon, a border tax adjustment, it would have significant impact on our exports, since it's a high level of carbon intensity going into the manufacturing of that. So it makes sense for us to think about how we introduce new energy vehicles, and particularly electric vehicles, in a sector where we're quite, global leaders in the development of the auto sector. The third sector, of course, is a nascent sector and an area that requires a lot of development, but because where we sit, being one of the leaders export in the PMG platinum metal groups, we have an abundance of resources that could be utilized for green hydrogen, for example. And this is some area that we've talked about. So we've done this exercise of developing an investment plan, as the Commissioner had spoken about, and that is quite critical. We're in the process of developing an implementation plan. We're implementing the Just Energy Transition Partnership that is there. But there is a conversation, and I just in my last point, there is a conversation to be had about how do we, so there's an interesting debate that is happening in South Africa around, do you decarbonize and shut down or decommission, as we know, power stations or coal-powered fire stations in the context of a power crisis, right? And we have one of the severest power crises. This has been an ongoing crisis. And of course, as you've reflected, where there are significant risks and conflict, there's an opportunity in that. And so, of course, it creates an opportunity for us. But our power crisis is twofold. Number one, there's a shortage of supply. And secondly, even if we put on, let's assume 50 gigawatts of renewable energy, we have a grid-constrained environment. Our grid has never been designed for that. And as I say, the strongest part of the grid is precisely in that province. So if where we look at our best energy, our sun and wind resources, it's on the provinces and on the coastal areas, and that is where the grid is not the strongest. We're required to invest a huge amounts of money into high voltage cable, 14,000 kilometers of investment in transmission lines. That is what is required. So, I mean, you have a shortage of supply and you have a grid constrained environment. It makes quite a disastrous kind of a challenge that we have to face. But in that, there's an opportunity. So there is a conversation to be had as to how one deals with the power crisis and use this as an opportunity towards a just transition going forward.
Thank you, Mr. Dix. I will now turn to Mr. Kusdiana. Indonesia faces significant challenges ahead. Coal plays still a very large part in your energy mix. More than 60% of the total electricity consumption still comes from coal. And in addition, in 2020, Indonesia was the largest exporter of coal in the world. But nevertheless, you signed the Global Coal to Power Transition Statement at the COP26 and presented your decarbonization pathway at the G20 in November last year, showing a very ambitious CO2 reduction pathway. So this is very impressive, and that's why we would like to hear from you. How do you plan to embark on this transition? How do you plan to make it just and inclusive, and also deal with the challenges that were just mentioned by Mr. Dix on trying to find a balance between the decarbonization but also keeping the electricity flowing in the grid?
Thank you. Thank you, Ms. Veronique Mark. Very good evening from Jakarta. Thank you for inviting also Indonesia to join this very important session to us also. Actually, thank you also to South Africa. We have learned for almost 2 years what's the progress happening in South Africa, in particular for the JTP program. I would like to start with the commitment that Indonesia has given into the COP26. It was by our President Joko Widodo at the time, that Indonesia has committed. There are 2 commitments actually. The first is to increase our commitment on NDC. I think it was given last year in some FC that we increase our commitment from 29% to 32%. And during the COP26, my president gave the commitment for the net zero emission, 2060 or earlier. There are 1 or 2 countries also providing the commitment more than 2060. So that's the first that I would like to mention. So in terms of the strategic measure, Indonesia has taken several strategic measures to accelerate the energy transition in the country. Such as the first is the carbon reduction initiative to development, in particular renewable energy. We are also currently converting the diesel power plant to gas as the transition in this electricity provision. Development of electric vehicles as well as also the conversion of combustion, increasing the share of renewable energy and promoting the direct use of renewable energy in the industrial sectors. Here in Indonesia, electricity in the industrial sector is only account for 28%. So dealing with electricity in the industrial sector is not enough to go for the net zero emission. In addition, the government has also implemented several energy efficiency efforts, such as expanding minimum energy performance standards and also mandatory energy management in energy-intensive industries and also high-performance buildings. We have issued the presidential regulation last year, stressing that Indonesia will accelerate the implementation of renewable energy and at the same time pacing down the use of coal-fired power plant. So we have no plan to add more coal-fired power plant, except for those that already being in the construction or being contracted by PPA. The roadmap for the early retirement of coal-fired power plant and the market mechanism is currently being prepared. Our ministry, the Ministry of Energy and Mineral Resources, is coordinating with the other ministries and also our state-owned company for electricity and the financial institution to set priorities for implementing power sector decarbonization. There are strategic action being taken to decarbonize the power sector in the country, such as development of around 21 gigawatt of renewable energy power plants by 2030. This is already in our planning. We are also converting the diesel power plant, as I mentioned earlier, to be powered by gas in 47 locations with total capacity of 3.2 gigawatt. We are also converting the diesel power plant directly to renewable energy. This happened in so many locations, 2,130 locations. We just started the program with a capacity of 500 megawatt. As you may aware that Indonesia is archipelagic countries. So many of our power generation coming from very small distributed of diesel power plant. Now we are converting this to renewable energy. Of course, we need also the technology in energy storage. And also we are now implementing co-firing in 113 existing coal-fired power plant with a total capacity of 19 gigawatt. So we blend coal with biomass. So we blend coal with the renewable energy. So we are trying to increase directly the use of renewable energy with the existing asset. And the roadmap for a retirement of coal-fired power plants until 2030 is targeted to achieve early retirement of power generation with a total capacity of roughly 6 gigawatt. This is in line with the CO2 emission reduction target agreed upon the JTP, which is around 300 million metric ton by 2030. To ensure the reliability and sufficiency of electricity supply after the retirement of 6 gigawatt of coal-fired power plants, several alternative scenarios are proposed, including the potential use of energy from renewable energy, and also the use of battery storage, and also the potential use of energy from renewable sources through Java and Sumatra interconnection. So we are trying also to do interconnection between some islands, and also scenario of the co-firing, as I mentioned. International support as the JTP will of course, I believe that will accelerate the decarbonization to a breakthrough funding mechanism. This is combination between the use of public and private funding, grant, and also loans. So 3 weeks ago, we had also a very good meeting with IPG in the Washington, D.C. Thank you for the support of the international partner group with many in for us to finalize the commitment that has been given of 20 billion US dollar for the Indonesia energy transition. The JTP Working Group Secretariat, which is ready to work on realizing funding cooperation for energy transition, has been formed. The office has been officially opened in the Office of Ministry of Energy and Mineral Resources. Currently, we are hiring the full-time staff on this. We try also to do the communication with other aligned ministries on how to accelerate the activity within the JTP Working Group Secretariat. So the JTP structure consists of the 3 levels. I think this is also as the result of the consultation with South Africa in this regard, namely the task force within the government. There are also task force between IPG member, and we have very specific full-time member in the JTP Secretariat and also the project implementation. The government has assigned PT-SMI as the country platform, coordinates at the project level for the transaction layer. The types of project under the JTP include early retirement of coal-fired power plant, development of renewable energy power plant, development of grid and transmission. I think we are sharing the same issues also as have also in South Africa. Renewable energy supply chains. Thank you also to Lara for mentioning this. This is also very important to ensure that the just transition will happen. Yeah, it's not only having the renewable energy, but also having more industry, manufacturing industry in the supply chain in the country, improving energy efficiency, and of course the just transition. International Energy Agency, IEA, World Bank, United Nations Development Program, and also ASEAN Development Bank and others development organization from countries, for example, GIZ, will be sitting in the working groups and help the JTP Secretariat in setting up implementable comprehensive investment plan or CIP within 3 to 6 months timelines. This CIP will contain of the just and inclusive energy transition strategies in proper manner to meet Indonesia development and climate objectives. So in short, to summarize the activity here in the country, we have put the priorities. So there are 5 priorities here for the implementation in short time. The first is to do the grid interconnection, because we are huge in terms of the renewable energy potential, but sometimes in some area it doesn't match with the load center. So we need how to connect the resources to the load center. So this will be our project in the comprehensive investment plan. The second is the commissioning coal-fired power plant. As I mentioned earlier, we work with many organizations here with the support of IEA on how to do the best solution. Yeah, combination between supply and demand. Currently, Indonesia is the excess supply in terms of the electricity. It's a little bit different with what mentioned in Sri Lanka and probably or the electricity. In fact, that the contract between our state-owned company, the only off-taker of the electricity with the IPP, this is take or pay. So we have to take into account how the impact when we do the coal-fired power plant early retirement. The third is to have more renewable energy in the country. And fourth is the decarbonization. So we are trying to do electrification to increase the use of electricity in activities, for example, EV program, and we are trying also to substitute the use of the LPG in particular in household to be electrification, since we are actually in the excess supply of electricity. So I think those that currently is happening here in the country. Of course, we have the commitment, but in particular, we would like also to have the clear and also to finalize the support coming from the IPG member countries, including also from the G funds, on the terms and conditions for the financial support. But other than that, as I mentioned, we have already our general planning for having 21 gigawatt of renewable energy, increasing renewable energy, as well as also the grid interconnection. So we do with this JTP is how then to accelerate the implementation in both ways. The first is the early retirement, and the other is to have more renewable energy into the grid. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Kuzdiana. Thank you so much. I will now continue turning east on the planet to Colombia, Mrs. Castellanos. After the two speakers really explained much more the technological energy side of the just transition, I would like to hear from you in Colombia. How do you integrate kind of the social impacts of this just transition, and how do you ensure that those possibly or perhaps negatively impacted are protected and supported?
Thank you, everybody. Thank you for the invitation. I want to start my intervention just to say that the just energy transition, as you mentioned before, is a huge challenge. And of course, to integrate in our policies the social and climate impacts is a huge too. It's a challenge that required that all ministries work together. And in our case, the social impact is not only depend of our ministry, it's a government goal. But in this sense, we can classify some inputs that are very important to take in account. Of course, we need to take in account finance assistance to develop new industries, job opportunities, for example, in green technology, implementation of programs to retain, for example, workers who may be displaced in the transition to the low carbon economies. And one important thing is to involve the affected communities, because we can't develop some policies without these communities, with these local impacts. And it means that we need to immerse in the reality of the communities and to see how can the government help to try to pass or try to mitigate or try to reduce the negative impacts. So in this approach, so we have, for example, tried to explain some important issues. For example, the inclusive policy development, the integrated policy framework, the just transition measures, the green job creation, the social protection measures, the education and capacity buildings, the monitoring and evaluation of our policies. So I want to explain a little bit each of these points. So we consider that our development of our policies need to be inclusive. So what it means that we need to take in account the stakeholders of the energy, of course, but all ecosystem around. So it means that we need to consider different type of sectors of the industry, the energy and the industry that complement to the energy industry. And of course, in different levels of the society. It means local communities, affected industries, vulnerable population, for example. The second point that I mentioned is the integrate policy framework. And what it means that we need to involve not just energy dimensions, we need to analyze and promote some policies in economical, social, and environmental dimensions. So this comprehensive or this integration, it's very important in order to, for example, try to propose some policies in try to reduce the poverty or the social inclusion, the economical growth. It's a complementing issues. And of course, we need to try to don't exacerbate the socioeconomic disparities. And for that reason, I mentioned that it's a huge challenge because we consider that the just energy transition is not only the energy transition, is the economical, is changing the mind, it's changing the model in the economical models. In our case in Colombia, our economical model is mainly extractivist, and we want to change this paradigm and try to, as some presentation before, to try to have the industrialism model. So it required not just an energy movement, it required a huge effort of different parts from the job, from the economical dimensions, social dimensions, environmental. So it's a complementary. So in the just transition policies and just transition measures, we need to work to seek to try to minimize the impacts to develop this transition to a low carbon economies. What it means that we need to work in job training and placement programs, in input support and social safety, for example. And one important example that I want to mention is that we are working to develop a national plan of the transition of coal in mining regions. For us, it's a reality where carbon or coal mines start to closing, and it has a huge impacts in our regions. The people in the regions that work only in mining only know mining. So we need to diverse, we need to change. Respect to the green job creations, we need to invest a lot of efforts in create green jobs and to diversify the economy and to create sustainable, for example, agriculture, work on energy efficiency jobs and renewable energy jobs. And the next step or the next point is the social protection measures. So nowadays, Colombia has some programs. For example, we have some subsidies and electricity, for example, but we have subsidies in the gas, for example, or in other energetics. But we need to work now to try to transfer these subsidies in new goals or new benefit for the communities in this transition. And of course, we need to work in the social safety needs to protect the low incomes household, indigenous communities, and small farmers. So it's very important that in this transition, we try to ensure this social protection or work on that direction. So the last point, education and capacity building. So we consider that we need to create new capacity, new programs to build in association, for example, with our Ministry of Education and our Ministry of Science. But of course, we need to work together, not only in Colombia, with international partners that can help us to build and support this transition to a low carbon economy. Respecting to the monitoring and evaluation points, for us it's very important to evaluate and monitoring the mechanisms that we are proposed to the policy. We need to react in real time because we need to be able to do making necessary adjustments based on the findings. So all of these points help us to develop policies in ongoing process. And we know that it's not a challenge of Colombia. It's a challenge of all of this type of country that want to go in the just energy transition. So we need to define strategies based on feedback evaluation and our own needs, depending on our stakeholders and our community, to changing circumstances or try to develop these climate policies that allow social, inclusive, and economical sustainable growth. Just for finalize this intervention, I want to tell you that we are working and we have some regulations and laws that start with this transition. For example, respect to the promote renewable energies, we have some laws developed. For example, we have the law 1715, of course it's a local law, but this tries to promote the renewable energy. We have another law for the climate change mitigation, and we have another law for the health of the environment. So I consider that we are a country that have a good initiative, for example, in Latin America, to develop some laws, regulations, and decrees that try to help to accelerate this transition. But we need more. We need continuously work hard and develop new strategies, because we want to include the social effects. Now we have another regulatory instrument like Compass that is in our country, in energy transition, in sustainable building, in quality, in sustainable mobility, and additional, for example, to the expansion of the non-conventional renewable energies. We have in biofuels, for example, some decrees and resolution that help us to develop this type of energetics in our country. Finally, I want to mention that we have some regulation that try to foment the new industry, focus on the renewable energy. But of course, if you see, you can say, oh, you have many instruments, or you have a lot of tools for work, and it is true, but we know that it's just the beginning. We need to work continuously hard to accelerate this energy transition, because we need, or we have a lot of things to do. So thank you for this invitation.
Castellanos, also here in the discussions that we had over the past 2 days, we've heard a lot about that it's a long-term process, and also how to move from the strategy to the implementation of the programs. I will now also turn to Ms. Gordon. Discussing governance models in the just transition process, we would like to hear from you a little bit more on these rapid response teams that you have put in place in the US, especially to support the regions in the urgency of a coal plant or mine closure. Could you please explain us a little bit more of these rapid response teams?
Thank you. Sure. I'm very happy to be here, and I will try to keep this somewhat short. I see we're fairly short on time. So let me give a little bit of context on the U.S. response in the President Biden's administration in general on just transition, and then I'll talk about that governance structure piece. At the very beginning of this administration, the president issued an executive order on climate change that was very broad and far-reaching, and laid out our goals, including the important goal of 100%, getting to 100% clean electricity by 2035, which is very ambitious. In that executive order, importantly, the president created this structure, governance structure, which is the Interagency Work Group on Coal and Power Plant Communities and Economic Revitalization. And that governance structure is an interagency governance structure that is co-chaired by various parts of the White House, the National Economic Council, and the Domestic Climate Policy Office. which was also created in that order and administered by my office, the Department of Energy, and by my secretary, with 11 other agencies involved. And I point to that because it is a interagency and very integrated approach to this issue of transition, and very much an economic development approach. Just to some of the points others have made, this is not a classic sort of global climate policy approach. It really is the understanding that these strategies and solutions are very place-based. They're very dependent on the individual community, the condition of the specific site, the workers, and all of the elements that go into thinking about what the future is for that place. And so that creation of that interagency work group is an interesting structure. It has that White House-driven structure, but it actually functions almost like an independent organization. The White House co-chairs and my secretary act as essentially an executive committee of the board. The rest of the agency secretaries are the board of directors, and then we actually have a structure with an executive director and a deputy director that run this day to day with a number of contractors. They're all from within our Department of Energy. And that has been important because it's allowed for kind of faster decisions and for structures to be set up around engaging early with outreach to those regions. We spent a lot of time at the beginning identifying the regions with the most urgent needs on transition. And just for context, the U.S. has closed almost 300 coal plants since 2010. That was about 40% of our generating capacity. We have another 25% slated to close, on the books to close by 2029. So this is a significant number of plants and places, including all the mines that support those plants. And this is, so it really spans the entire US. So that governance structure has, in the early days, really focused on outreach and engagement with these places with the most urgency. We did a fair amount of geospatial mapping to identify which communities and regions had the most direct employment in coal as a percent of overall employment. And we started with coal because, of course, it is the more urgent transition need, but the interagency work group actually extends to oil and gas as well. Looking at the regions with the highest direct employment percentage of coal, and then also the number, sort of concentrations of plant closures. And in those communities, we've done a lot of outreach and engagement. We created a clearinghouse, an online clearinghouse of all of the existing federal resources that could be aligned toward those regions. And we really started with some of the most urgent needs. You know, if you think about what these places need, essentially, it's a phased approach, as others have said. There's immediate acute needs around worker and land support. So displaced worker, the health issues of workers, but then also a need to think about land remediation and reclamation to get the land back to a place where you can do anything else with it. There's a need for planning for economic development and planning for the future. That includes a lot of asset mapping. What are the assets the region has? And then, of course, investments in new industries. And so we spent a lot of time in these places at the beginning, focusing very broadly on aligning federal resources toward those goals. I won't say too much about this other than to say we've been incredibly blessed with this administration to have a significant amount of new resources on the table to be able to do this work. During this administration, the president has signed 3 very significant pieces of legislation: the infrastructure law that we have, a law focused on rebuilding our semiconductor industry, which is, of course, critical to clean energy, and then the Inflation Reduction Act, which is the big climate law. Those 3 together now give us enormous amount of new funding for both a focus on energy communities, so really directing funding toward energy communities, specifically coal, but expanding into oil and gas, and then a focus on funding to repurpose or reuse or decarbonize existing energy assets. And I really want to say how important that is. Reuse of coal plants is a very big thing in our strategy. These are places with interconnections to the grid. They have transportation access already. There's a workforce in the region, and they are often have water rights and other important industrial assets. And so we're focusing on that as well. So finally, to your question, because of these new resources being on the table, we've been able to actually take our very broad strategy of engagement with these regions and sort of generalize policy support and become very specific by creating these rapid response teams in those regions with that urgency around coal plant or mine closures. Those rapid response teams are teams of regional level staff who live in the area from our federal agencies, working in coalition with on the ground organizations, labor unions, and of course, local officials to really address specific needs of those specific regions. We've started with Wyoming in our Intermountain West area, which is a very big coal region and still producing actually quite a lot of coal. The Four Corners region, which is that intersection in the southwest of New Mexico, Arizona, Colorado, and Utah. So that's a really important region. And then Southern Illinois, which is in the Midwest, and at the very top of our Appalachia region, which extends down into West Virginia. Those are all heavily coal dependent from an economic perspective, but with significant amount of closure. And in each of those regions, and we'll be expanding into about 5 more this year, we are doing these very specific place-based approaches with unique approaches to those places. Wyoming is very, very different from Appalachia. Appalachian coal is essentially over. We've shifted most of our production that still exists to Wyoming because the coal is just higher quality. So where we still produce coal, it's mostly in the Wyoming area. So West Virginia has already gone through a transition not particularly well managed. And so a lot of that support is, working with workers who've been laid off for years and supporting them in identifying, planning for new industrial development using some of these new resources that we have. Whereas in Wyoming, it's a little bit of an earlier strategy. And in Four Corners, the strategy is very integrated with our strategy around indigenous people because that area is very heavily tribal. Tribal in nature, where the Navajo reservation is there, and that's a large part of that region. And so our tribal engagement is a big part of that. So I don't have much time, so I won't go into detail on any of these things other than to say, I think the governance structure is incredibly important in having it be something that is fairly formalized, not just a usual interagency meeting every month and then you go back to your agency, but really we've been trying to work with both the structure and frankly funding. I would say our biggest challenge, and I think I shared this with other countries, it's very hard to organize federal funding or national funding toward this kind of integrated approach. We all have very siloed budgets for different things. And you actually have to combine them all to do this work. And so we've used the structure to do that. And then really recognizing that this cannot just be top down, that you do need to get in and do place-based individual approaches in different places with those stakeholders has been another learning. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Mrs. Gordon. That was very interesting. Looking at the time and my colleagues, I think maybe we have time for one small question, perhaps from the audience. Would anyone like to come in or online with a small question? No, I think
we have an interesting online question. So first of all is to Rudy Dix, in the context of historical societal challenges that had South Africa, how do you implement procedural justice in your just transition process? And a second interesting question is, so how, to all panelists, how do you define green jobs? And do you have a specific scheme to support them?
Rudy, Sean, could you respond briefly?
Quickly.
Thank you.
Yeah, can we respond briefly? I mean, of course, the historical context matters, right? With a unemployment rate of 32%, that's narrow definition. It does matter when you have close to 200,000 workers linked to the coal value chain, and you're talking about a transition where you're unable to transition them adequately into other forms of employment or redevelop their skills. So of course it has to be an important conversation when you talk about justice and administrative justice in this particular context. And generally speaking, I mean, this is the problem with us when we do transitions, communities, workers, civil society organizations are always at the the wrong end of these transitions. We talk about a just transition in the context of something up there that is, don't worry, in the long run, you'll all get employment. Don't worry, in the long run, you're all going to get skills. And for us, this is quite an important area of work. And during our consultation with community-based organizations, with labor unions, there was a strong voice around in the investment plan to put adequate resources and a sufficient amount of financing and opportunities for workers to be able to transition. And it's not like for like jobs, because we understand that. But certainly you're going to have a proper conversation around how you adequately phase this in over time. And the importance is that this kind of transition is not going to happen tomorrow or in the next 2 to 3 years. We have to manage it in a manner that we don't exacerbate our employment situation, high levels of poverty, particularly in those areas where youth unemployment is significantly higher. So I think it's quite critical. It is part of the discourse, it's part of the conversations that we're having as we unfold and implement the investment plan. It's a very, very a tough debate and in a difficult situation. But I think we're doing pretty well in having that kind of conversations and making sure that we allocate sufficient resources. Just by the way, sorry, it's just while you close off. I mean, when we did the investment plan, we costed it, right, based on a relatively ambitious end of our NDC range. It's going to cost us over 5 years, $90 billion to adequately manage that. So, transitions are not cheap. Transitions are expensive. And if you want to have a proper transition where you do ensure that workers are not out of jobs, communities are not out of income earned, small business people are not out of, the value chains, you have to look at it in a very detailed and granular form. And I like Kate's point around looking at some of those geographically located interventions. That's precisely what we're doing. Our focus is on those particular regions and municipalities that have that will have a significant impact if we do have to when we do this implementation of a just energy transition.
Thank you, Rudy.
Can I say one word on the green jobs question very, very fast?
You can.
We try not to use that term at all anymore. There are no green jobs. We are decarbonizing the entire economy. Every industry will have jobs that are in service of our climate agenda. Calling those a niche side type of jobs is actually, I think, a disservice to the agenda. So we have moved away from the term completely.
Thank you. And as we draw into a close, could I perhaps just ask one last small statement from Mrs. Castellano and Mr. Katsuna, just to close, like what's the takeaway that what's the takeaway or the message that you want to pass us? Just a very small message that we should take away from this conversation from your countries.
Thank you. Yeah.
Yep.
I have a small number here in Indonesia. The first is 1.3 jobs per megawatt of coal-fired power plant. And we have the other number is 2 jobs per megawatt up to 5 jobs per megawatt if we are developing renewable energy. So with this, actually, if we are talking about the issue of jobs, if we have more renewable energy, then there will be more jobs. But of course, there are issues that I do understand, and we are also here internally, domestically, trying to see the best way to do is for the existing jobs in the coal productions. So there are 3 at least during the coal productions in upstream, and the supply chains, transportation, tanker, for example, and at the end is the coal-fired power plant. So for that one, what we do is we are now trying to offer the training for the human resource development. I do agree that, and this is also our planning to develop the manufacturing industries for renewable energy and also their supply chain. So I think this too currently is in our pipeline for the development. So thank you.
Ms. Cassiano, very, very short. What's the takeaway for us?
Thank you. Just for finishing this intervention, I want to mention that we are working on our roadmap. So we're defining and identifying the barriers and of course, developing all plans, the investment plan, the analysis of economical, environmental, and social aspects, and to define the regulatory enables to develop our just energy transition. And my last message is that we need to work together because it's not possible if we work like an island. We need to work with the communities, we need to work with the people, and of course, as a government in a perfect union.
Thank you, Ms. Kasian, and I think this is a very nice closing, the working together in this platform conference. So I thank you very much for this session, and I will now ask my colleague Sandra to come to close the conference. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Veronique, and thank you for giving us the opportunity to hear from countries across the globe on how they are addressing just transition issues. It's comforting to see we are not alone in this effort. But now we are getting closer to the end of this conference. It was already the 7th conference of the Just Transition platform. It's a mechanism that we established from the start when we were starting to prepare the Just Transition Fund to also make sure that everyone understands that this was always going to be a joint effort and that we will continue listening to all the stakeholders throughout the preparation and also implementation of the Just Transition Fund. So this is what we are doing. But now, of course, we have the plans in place. As was explained, the implementation is fully ongoing in all the JTF regions, and this implementation comes with several challenges. And the Just Transition platform will continue to be here to accompany that process. So in the past 2 days, we have heard about all the efforts that are ongoing in the JTF regions to get the projects off the ground. And we spoke about the issues that you are facing in that process, such as the skills challenges, the demographic questions that some regions are facing, the needs to communicate, the need to have also a different view and mindset of, for instance, industry in Europe in the future, the role of economic ecosystems, of universities and youth, and of other specific actors. We spoke about how we need to also address energy poverty issues in the Just Transition, how to make the regions more attractive going forward, and how to monitor all these efforts for a just transition. So many topics that we discussed and that we will continue to discuss. But we also saw community building. I think we are seeing a JTF family. I'm using the words of one of the speakers yesterday, a JTF family that is emerging. And this is also very encouraging to see. I saw several of you discovering each other's efforts and sharing experience. And this is really also what the Just Transition platform is for. We observed that many people want to be here. We had more than 1,000 registrations. 200 people came here yesterday and today, and hundreds more joined us online. And also online, we had very lively discussions in some of the sessions. As you can imagine, organizing this conference is a joint effort, and there were a lot of people involved, so I would really like to thank all my colleagues in DG Regio and in DG Energy, the secretariats of the Just Transition platform, and the Coal Regions in Transition initiative. And I cannot name all of you, but I really want to thank one person in particular, and that is my colleague Balbina Gluza. So she's really the driving force of the platform. So thank you, Balbina. We would not be here without you. Yes. And she's also the person to go to if you want to be on stage next time and speak about your specific initiatives. So talk to Balbina. But also the interpreters, thank you so much for doing your excellent work and making sure that also in other languages people were being heard and could ask their questions. Thank you to all the speakers who were here, and especially to you all in the JTF regions, because the implementation of the JTF and ultimately the success of the Just Transition Fund depends on you. So let me now close formally this conference. However, it doesn't stop here. We will actually continue. As you know, tomorrow there is the multi-level dialogue organized by the Committee of the Regions. In DG Regio, we will have also the meetings of the Just Transition Platform working groups. And I know that several of you are using the occasion to meet with your counterparts in the Commission services. So the week continues. As for next steps, we have heard already about the annual political dialogue in Karlovy Vary that is specifically for the coal regions. And then for everyone, all the JTF regions, we will meet again here in the Just Transition Platform Conference in October. You will hear more about this soon. So that is it from us, but don't leave if you still want to hear more practically about the support that the Just Transition Platform is going to give on the ground in the next months. So this is a session, a side session that will take place immediately after this one. It will be very practical. You will hear from our contractors from Balbina, and you will be able to ask all the questions that you still have. So thank you very much, and hope to see you next time.